This presentation is about a key technique in research writing that I want to show you. And this particular technique is something that you would use at the beginning of a research project for a master's or a PhD thesis or dissertation. But it's also a technique that you can use as you work through the process, and particularly if you get stuck. So what I'm saying is that this is a technique that is ongoing throughout the research process, and it's something that really helps you to clarify your thinking and to pull together all the various threads so that you've got a clear idea of what you're doing. Because a research project slides and moves in the process of doing it, it's very useful to come back to this at different points in the project. So what you're trying to do in a master's or PhD project is you're making an argument. We tend to think that academic writing is about facts, but really it's about making an argument that is conceptualized around a problem. And the problem is important to a particular discipline or discourse community. So not all problems will be relevant for all disciplines. So the problem that you decide on should be relevant to your particular discourse community. So what you're doing is you're making this argument, and the more convincing your evidence is, the more truth-like your claims become. So your evidence is very important. And of course, that evidence will appeal to a particular discipline or discourse community as well. So it won't be the same for every discipline. So this is what your thesis is about, is making an argument around a particular problem and then providing evidence to support that problem. The reason why I use this technique is because masters and particularly PhD dissertations have multiple arguments and have multiple problems, or let's put it this way, related problems in a thesis. So for example, you're making arguments like the need for this research, why I'm doing this research is a particular argument. Where this research fits in the literature is another argument. What the conceptual framework is, why this particular methodology is useful and not another one, why these results are valid, why the way I've made sense of these results is useful in making or understanding claims, and why these conclusions make sense. So throughout your thesis, that's what you're carrying, is all these different arguments. And this particular technique allows us to keep track of those arguments and to provide you at least with some clarity. And the reason why this technique is so useful is because there's an assumption that when you come to a research project, you know nothing. You are a tabula rasa, an empty, and that you start at the beginning and then you work your way through this almost linear process towards the end. And as you work your way through that process, the assumption is that you gather knowledge, and by the end of the process, you then know everything about that topic. So there's this kind of linear beginning, so you can see a clear beginning, you follow a clear path, and then you come to an end. What really happens is that often you are immersed in this very chaotic environment where there's no real beginning or ending. You can't find a beginning or an ending. Sometimes you're working in the field in which you're conducting research, so you know a lot about the area already. So you almost have to go back and find a beginning. At other times, you may just know a lot about the topic, or there may be multiple ways of thinking about your research, and you have to figure out where you stand in that. So generally, the research environment is completely chaotic. It's not this neat linear process. Sometimes you begin right in the middle of things. So this technique is about finding a pathway through the chaos. So it's extracting a golden thread so that you can see what you're trying to do, and then you build in the complexity later on. So the process that I'm suggesting is simplifying, and then once you're clear about the simple things, then you can build in the complexity afterwards. So this technique is a way of clarifying your thinking, and then afterwards you would develop hypotheses, variables, research questions, etc. So the technique is called the problem purpose statement and questions, or PPS and Q for short. And you've probably done problem purpose statements before, but this is done in a particular way. And this is a thinking tool, but it can also be used as a writing tool. So in some disciplines, you may not use the problem purpose statement in the writing, although I would certainly recommend that in any research project, you put your problem purpose statements in, because it will be the clear thinking around this project. But for my purposes, what I want you to use it for now is a thinking tool. So then you don't have to worry about how it's written at this point. The focus is on the meat, on getting the project thought through. So it's about the thinking around your project and not the writing. The next point is that a problem purpose statement is always a work in progress. So you begin it perhaps with very little knowledge, and then you build and build and build, and you change as you go along. And throughout the duration of your project, it will change, because the more you read, your thinking changes. And then once you've collected the data, you'll find that it might have shifted a little bit and you need to rethink a few things. So right up until the last day, your problem purpose statement is a work in progress, and it helps you to align the various components in your project. The person who developed this problem purpose statement was Sharon Merriam, and she's a qualitative researcher, and this comes from her book, Qualitative Research. And I think there's a new edition out, a 2012 version. But if you are a qualitative researcher, I would definitely get her book. She writes very clearly, and she's very helpful in setting up a project. And if you're not a qualitative researcher, this technique works just as well anyway. And it also comes from Harry Walcott, and then I have written about this in 3 books as well. So the first thing that goes into the problem statement, so we begin with the problem statement, and I forgot to mention that the problem purpose statement is only ever 1 page long. If you find your problem purpose statement is longer than 1 page, then you need to rewrite it. So it must fit in 1 page. So the first thing that goes into the problem statement is a sentence or 2 around the problem. And you can finish the sentence. The problem here, or the problem in this context, is if you're finding it difficult to identify the problem. Research is always conceptualized around a problem. And there's a very good reason why, if you think about it. If research isn't conceptualized around a problem, then the question is, why are you researching this? So identifying the problem provides you with a rationale for doing this research. The stronger you articulate the problem as a problem, the more you are providing the rationale for doing this research. Now, it's easy to say identify the problem in your research, but it's much more difficult to do it. It's difficult because problems are never unrelated to other problems, because the research context and life generally is chaotic. Problems are always connected. And really what you're trying to do is to work out what is the problem that's in the foreground in my research, and which problems will move into the background. So although they're important, they're not the focus of this research. So you want to try and work out what is the focus, what is in the foreground. And the other thing is, we often talk about research in terms of topics, which is very broad, whereas the problem gets quite specific. So make sure that when you identify the problem, you articulate it as a problem and not a topic. And I will show you an example shortly. The next thing that goes into your problem purpose statement is the knowledge gap. Now, the knowledge gap is something that is very specific to academic contexts. In other contexts, you wouldn't really need to provide this. But in academic contexts, we have this assumption that all research builds on previous research. And the knowledge gap shows how your research will fit in with previous research. So will it add to previous research, and in what ways? And it provides the academic rationale for doing this research. So you need one to three sentences that identify the knowledge gap. And the way you would normally write it would be to say something like, well, much research is being conducted on X, Y, and Z. Little is known about this, and that's your particular topic. And the knowledge gap is constructed. And what I mean by that is that you might be working in a research area where there is a lot of research that's being conducted on that topic. And then you have to find a knowledge gap. You have to create a knowledge gap. So you would say, while a lot of research is being conducted in this area, very little is known in this particular context, with this particular cohort, in this age group. So you're specifying smaller and smaller areas that haven't been researched. So that's why it's constructed. The next thing that goes into the problem statement is a sentence or two that provides the context for the study. And the context is really what grounds the research. So this is the time, the place, the people, whatever it is that you are studying, the thing, the document, the whatever your samples are. So this is where you would say that the study is happening currently or historically or 10 years ago, and it's happening around this particular group of people or documents or amoeba or whatever it is that you're studying. So the next thing that goes into a problem statement is that you need to provide some evidence for either the existence of the problem, the existence of the knowledge gap, or the overall rationale for this research. So the logic and evidence refers to the fact that there is a logic to the way you're putting together this problem, and that you have some evidence. Now, I just want to mention a point on evidence in academic contexts. There are only two sources of evidence that count, really, in most academic contexts. And these are primary sources and secondary sources. And by primary sources here, I mean the raw data that you go and collect when you conduct research. So when you're doing your master's or PhD, that's what you're being examined on, is the primary data. Secondary data comes from published material where researchers have collected primary data, made sense of it, and published it, usually in peer review sources. Now, secondary data counts as evidence because of the peer review process. So the peer review process vets and gives a certain amount of authority to published papers so that it counts in academic context. It counts as evidence. Now, things like statistics also count as evidence, but they don't carry as much weight as primary and secondary data unless the bulk of your primary data is around existing statistics. Okay, so the point I'm making here is that if you can provide evidence for the problem, that this is a really big problem, and secondly, that there's a need to do this research, both academically and in the real world, then you have much more, you can make a much stronger claim because you have the evidence to support it. Okay. So the next thing that goes into your problem statement is a sentence or two about the conceptual framework. Now, the conceptual framework is the perspective or the lens that frames the study. For a master's degree, you are often not required to fully develop a conceptual framework. But for a PhD, generally, a conceptual framework is a really important part of the study because it's an acknowledgement of the kind of deeper thinking that goes behind any kind of claim. It's the broad kind of perspective or worldview that you're taking for this particular project. And a conceptual framework really shapes the whole thing. It will shape what counts as evidence, what your questions are, what kinds of questions you ask. So it can be quite important. And what I mean by conceptual framework, I'm using the broad phrase or broad word, but it could be a theory or it could be a model, it could be a theorist, anything that gives your project a kind of direction. So you need a sentence or two about that. So following so those 5 components make up the problem statement. The next thing is the purpose statement, and this is really a small paragraph where you answer or close the sentence. The purpose of this research is to. In my experience, if you don't have this sentence in your thesis somewhere, or in your proposal, or in your research paper, the very first question you will get asked is, what is the purpose of your research? So to me, it's very important that you have the sentence in there. So the purpose of this research is to, and then whatever word you use after that. So if you say to explore, or to evaluate, or to examine, or to assess, that word implies the methodology. So if you say to evaluate, you're implying a methodology that has some kind of criteria, some kind of process, and then some measurements at the end that can establish the end point, and how that's different from the beginning point, and whether those criteria were, well, you would measure it against those criteria. So the word that you're using is very important. You need to think about. So if you say explore, this is an open-ended qualitative study where you're going to find out something in a very loose, open-ended way. Assess means that you have this before and after and some kind of process of measuring. So you can add a sentence or two to further explain the methodology. And the further you go in the project, the more I would recommend that you do that. So you might say, the purpose of the study is to explore whatever. A case study will be used in a school or something like that, so you can expand on it. The most important thing about the purpose statement is that it must close the knowledge gap that you stated in the problem statements. So whatever you identified as the knowledge gap, this purpose statement must close it. So if you said little is known about, then the purpose of this research is to find out about whatever you identified there. And the purpose statement also identifies the broad goals of the research. So the purpose of this research is to find out something, do something, discover something. Those are the broad goals of the research. Okay. So after this purpose statement, the next thing that you have to think about are the research questions. And the research questions must unpack the problem. So you take your problem sentence and you see how you can divide up that problem sentence into different questions. So the reason why you unpack the problem is that you're focusing on one particular problem and you're not introducing new problems in the questions. The research questions also give an idea of the scope of the project. So if you're doing a master's, generally you wouldn't answer more than 3 questions. For a PhD, it would be no more than 5, generally, because you can see that if you have 7 to 10 questions, that would be an enormous project where you would have to provide some kind of answer, to those research questions. The other thing that you need to remember is you need to frame those questions as questions. So these are not the questions that you would ask an interviewee. These are questions that frame your research. They are guiding questions. So you could have one overall question and then sub-questions, or you can just divide your problem into 3 to 5 questions, depending on your purpose. Yeah, spend time thinking about the research questions, because this is often where problems arise, and I'm going to show you why now. Okay, so just to focus on the research questions, each question unpacks a research problem. So if we conceptualize the questions as an apple pie, or your problem as an apple pie, and then each question is a slice in that apple pie, some questions might have more weight than others, but the questions can provide a structure for the thesis, because if you have 3 questions, then you might have 3 data chapters where you're providing the data to answer each of those 3 questions. You don't have to do it like that, but it can provide a structure for the thesis, and then it can provide an element of coherence so that you're answering those questions. But what often happens is that in your apple pie, which is your problem, with your apple pie wedges, we often have a plum pie question that sneaks its way in. And the reason why we have that is because you're not starting with no knowledge. Often people are starting with a lot of knowledge about their research area. And the plum pie question is often a conclusion. So, for example, if you're doing research on an organization, then you might know what the solution to this is, but you still have to conduct the research. And often that knowing falls into a question, which is really not part of this project or part of conceptualizing it in this way, but it is a conclusion. It's very important, and I would say you need to keep it. But in terms of conceptualizing this research, it doesn't belong in your apple pie of questions. And I'm going to show you an example now. So this is an example problem purpose statement, and I'm going to read through it. So, more mature students are returning to higher education institutions in Canada than ever before. Statistics from, and I made up a term here, StatsCo, show that before 2004, 15% of students were above the age of 20 when entering their first year of study. Since then, this figure has increased to 35%. So, mature students find it difficult to return to studying after a number of years away from educational environments. That is the problem statement. They find it difficult. So it is a problem, and it's stated as a problem. Although research is being conducted on access to higher education institutions for mature students, reference, and on mature students' academic performance, reference, little is known about the studying practices of these students when they return to learning after periods away from education. So that is your knowledge gap. So although there's a lot of research being conducted on this, little is known about my research area, and that's why I'm doing this particular research. Febris and Segal argue that mature students often do not have the social capital necessary for the completion of studies, which is why they enter educational institutions as mature students. So that implies the conceptual framework. Social capital is the conceptual framework. This study intends to explore if the difficulties mature students experience in learning can be explained by a lack of social capital. That's expanding on the conceptual framework. So what you can see already from this example is that there's a logic to it, there's a context, there's statistics that provide evidence for the context, there are references which provide evidence for the need for this research, and there's a conceptual framework with citations as well. The purpose of this research is to explore what difficulties mature students experience when returning to educational studies after a gap period. So the purpose of this research is to explore. So that tells you that it's a qualitative study, it will be fairly open-ended, and probably will be based on interpretation of data, possibly interview data. The study intends to research how mature students in the education faculty at Memorial University study and how these study habits relate to social capital. So there you can see the methodology has been expanded a little bit. It's going to be conducted amongst students in the education faculty, And you can see that there will be questions about how their study habits relate to social capital. So, I mean, we could expand that even further and say through in-depth interviews, and that will make it much more specific. And as you move through your project, you want to make it as specific as possible. So now we come to the questions. The study seeks to address the following questions. What does returning student mean? What difficulties do mature returning students experience with their learning? How do institutional inefficiencies impact on mature students' experiences of learning? What study habits do mature returning students have? How do these study habits and difficulties relate to social capital? So what I've done is I have put in a plum pie question in these 5 questions. Now I wonder if you can see which question doesn't belong here. So the first question is, what does returning student mean? That is really a question that would be answered in the literature review, because that's a conceptual question. What does it mean to be a returning student? It can also be a data question. It could be something that you could ask your participants in the study. What does it mean to you to be a returning student? What difficulties do mature returning students experience? So you can see that's unpacking the problem. The problem is about their difficulties. So what difficulties do these students experience? How do institutional inefficiencies impact on mature students' experiences? That's the plum pie question. Because this question is not about how students experience learning, study habits, and the difficulties. It really is a conclusion. It's something that would come out of the study. It's a very important question, but it doesn't belong in this apple pie. So if you found that that's the question that really interests you, then you rework the problem purpose statements around that problem. So the problem would then be about the institutional inefficiencies rather than about the difficulties students experience. So for this particular project, what I would do is take that out, but keep it so that I can bring that back in the conclusion and see whether it's relevant at that point. So what study habits do mature students have? So we're looking at their difficulties, but also at what they do, so that we can make judgments on that. And then something to do with the conceptual framework. How do these study habits and difficulties relate to social capital? So all the other questions unpack the problem except for question number 3. So how does the problem purpose statement and questions provide you with some kind of coherence in this chaotic environment? Well, once you've got this conceptualized in one page, they become summaries of other sections of the paper. So you can take each part, each component of the problem purpose statement, and you can then develop them. So you can begin working on them, building until you get a chapter. So you can use the problem purpose statement for a research paper that you're sending off to a journal, for a research proposal, or for a thesis. And each of the different components can be built into whatever you need it to be. So it provides you with a summarized version of your thinking or conceptualization of this project. This particular technique of the problem purpose statement you can use in other ways as well. So for example, you can do an overall problem purpose statement for your thesis, but then you can do one for each chapter. So for example, you could do a problem purpose statement for the literature review chapter. You may find the problem is very similar to your overall problem, or it might be slightly different. So if you were looking at conceptualizations of mature students, perhaps the problem in the literature review paper or chapter is that mature students are conceptualized very differently, or that mature students have a derogatory element to that kind of description. So that would be a problem that you would then develop in the literature review chapter. And you could work out what the purpose of the chapter would be and also what the key questions would be that you're trying to address. So the problem purpose statement and questions is a very useful technique for other chapters as well. So then you can use that problem purpose statement for the chapter to see how it fits with the overall one. Now, the purpose statement is another paragraph that is very useful, and you can use this to check coherence throughout your thesis or whatever it is that you're writing. You can write a purpose statement for each chapter, and you can check if that matches your overall purpose statement. And you can even write a purpose statement for each section within a chapter. The purpose of this section is to, and then if you can work out what that purpose is in relation to the rest of the chapter, it will ensure that you're remaining relevant and focused. And if you can't work out the purpose for that section, then it needs to be deleted. And you can even bring it down to the paragraph level, where you can say the purpose of this paragraph is to, and then if you can't figure out how that paragraph fits in, it needs to be cut. So how does the problem, purpose statement, and question relate to an overall thesis? The problem and the context gets expanded into the introduction and background chapter. The knowledge gap and conceptual framework will become the literature review. The purpose statement becomes the methodology chapter, and the research questions become your findings or your data chapters. So this is where you would present the results. It's the presentation of your results. If you're struggling to write the problem purpose statements, then so if you find that you're really struggling to begin, break it down and focus on the problem before anything else. And in thinking through the problem, what I would suggest is, rather than trying to think of one, is to get a piece of paper and to write down as many problems as you can think of. And if you find you can't think of problems, then you need to go back to the literature and to read. The more you read, the more you'll be able to articulate problems. So you read, you write down problems, and then as you're writing them down, you're making decisions. You're saying, is that the problem I want to do research in this project, or is that the problem? Or is that too big of a problem and I need to break it down even more? So you have these kinds of conversations with yourself as you make decisions. And you might end up with 2 or 3 problems, and then gradually through revisions of your problem purpose statements, you would finalize which problem is important to you. So break it down, break the problem purpose statement down into the components and see which components you can work on. And if you do get stuck, you need to go back to reading, because that's what's going to provide you with the kind of basis. It'll give you the information to work from. The problem purpose statement is always a work in progress. And what I mean by this is that the very first thing students tell me when I say, okay, go and write your problem purpose statement, is they will say, well, I don't know enough and I have to go and read more. But you will know a certain amount. So it's a work in progress in that you need to write down what you know now. No matter how terrible it looks and no matter how thin it is. Or you might even be saying to yourself, is my problem this? So get a draft down as soon as you can and then fix it up. So it's always a work in progress, because you're continually aligning things in the project. You're aligning the purpose with the knowledge gap. You're aligning the questions with the problem. The other thing that I never mentioned is that if you want to work out your argument, what you do is you take your problem statement and you take a stance on that. So if the problem is that mature students are experiencing difficulties, then your argument might be mature students are experiencing difficulties because they don't get enough support. So there I'm taking a side, and that gives me an argument. Now, not all research projects need to have that argument stated up front. So in science dissertations, often the argument is quite embedded. But in the social science projects, arguments are really upfront. But either way, you want to know what your argument is, so that it's not coming through in your writing without you realizing it. So the problem purpose statement is always a work in progress, because you're continually refining these things. And what I would suggest is that you keep every iteration of it. So each draft, don't write over the previous draft, but rather keep it, cut and paste, and work on the new one. And then you'll be able to see how your thinking changes. But also you might find that an original question that you asked was actually a better one, and then you can bring that back into a later iteration of it. So let's see. Once you've done your problem purpose statement, it's very important that you get feedback on it. And there are two ways to get feedback. The first thing is to actually tell somebody, to verbalize, to actually speak to someone about your problem purpose statement. And then the other way of getting feedback is to give a written version and then ask specific questions. So what I would say is you get a group of your friends together and you say, my research is about this, the research problem is, and you talk them through your whole problem purpose statement. And then at some point you say, okay, what was my research problem? And they must say that research problem back to you. And you'll be able to see from the way they say it back to you whether or not you've said it clearly enough. So it's very helpful to do that verbally because it helps you to find the words to explain it. And it makes it much easier to write once you've done it verbally. Once you have your problem purpose statement written up, you can give it to your supervisor or anybody else who can read it, and then ask them to identify in the problem purpose statement what the research problem is, what the knowledge gap is, what the conceptual framework is, whether the research questions unpack the problem, whether the purpose statement closes the knowledge gap. Ask them all the questions that go into this problem purpose statement. And if they come back to you saying the scope is too large, then you know what to do. You reduce the number of questions. If they can't find your problem statement then, or your research problem, then you know that you need to articulate that more clearly. Okay. And ask them to pay particular attention to your research questions. Right, that's how you conceptualize your research with a problem purpose statement. I do have more of this in my books, but I will also have written notes up on my blog where you'll see there cecilebadenhorst.wordpress.com, and I'm adding material there all the time. So the notes are detailed notes with examples, and Sharon Merriam has examples in her book as well. So you can use the notes in conjunction with this slideshow to help you work through your problem purpose statements. And I wish you all the best of luck in developing it. Once you get the problem purpose statement worked out, you'll find that it's much easier to get going on the project. It's easier to write it. You feel more in control and more confident. You might find it a little bit difficult in the beginning to develop it, so you need to rework the problem purpose statement fairly often. But once you get it, you'll see that it will provide you with a really good map for where you need to go. All right, thanks. Bye.